This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Julie Henszey of the Ventura County Save Agriculture and Fresh Water for Everybody, which advocates for protecting our food, water, and the planet's health. Julie is affiliated to the grassroots group mounting an effort called Yes on Measures A and B, which will be on the ballot in June. I asked Julie here to explain Measures A and B and to educate the public about why these measures are significant to the safety of water in a county hit hard by drought. We're so happy to have you here today, Julie. I'm so pleased to have local women on the show who are committed to protecting our environment and are working toward mitigating climate change, because change happens on the local level. So, Julie, I was struck when we spoke earlier about how well your background fits with the work you do in environmental activism. Could you give your listeners a brief bio?
Sure, you bet. Thank you for having me, Kathleen. The things that have prepared me for my current job, one would be that I ran for the state Senate in Wisconsin back in 2018. Spent about a year doing that full time, and it was a really good learning experience. I ended up getting 49% of the vote. So,
oh my gosh,
just shy. And then I moved here, and the pandemic hit shortly after we moved here, maybe 5 months. And I, in the meantime, had found a job downtown with Downtown Ventura Partners. We ended up helping the historic shopping district and dining area to close down the street to cars and open it up to pedestrians during the height of the pandemic so that restaurants could have their tables outdoors and we could still have people go downtown. And that really got me involved with people on a one-to-one basis in the county. And so I started to understand, the culture and who's here and what's important to them.
You took a long walk here in California. Could you tell us about that?
Yes. I was fortunate enough to have time off and hiked the entire 200-mile John Muir Trail.
Wow.
From Yosemite down to Mount McKinley.
And John Muir was from Wisconsin, wasn't he?
He was. Very good. So my daughter did the first 90 miles with me. Then she left and I did the last 110 miles alone. It was gorgeous. I mean, just everywhere you looked. The challenge for me was they wouldn't allow anyone to bring in food. And normally a person gets resupplies, but with forest fires, I basically had to cover a lot of ground with very little food, but I got to the end.
Oh, wow. Wow. Do any of these actions come in handy now with the work that you have?
Yes. Well, definitely the state Senate race. All my knowledge about fundraising, finding partnerships that work to get the message out. That's been really helpful. Also, I just think, my connection with the outdoors. The work I'm doing now is all about saving the environment. So, I'm an honest advocate for the environment.
Okay. Now, there are many climate change nonprofit organizations operating in Ventura County, so it can be somewhat confusing. Now, you actually work for Save Agriculture and Fresh Water for Everybody right here in Ventura. But are you affiliated with the Food and Water Watch, which is a national organization? Just to clarify for folks.
Yes. So it's a partnership between two organizations in my current role. The funding for my position actually comes from Food and Water Watch, a national watchdog organization. And they have loaned me out, in so many words, to the local grassroots group that's trying to impact oil drilling in our county. So yeah, it's been a really good effort between these two groups. And I feel like our missions are aligned and I'm able to really, serve both groups with the current job.
Okay, so how long has Food and Water Watch been around? And who are you trying to influence with the work that you do?
Right. Food and Water Watch has been around for 14 years.
Oh,
It started because of a desire to build grassroots power, because when you have that kind of power, you can really change the direction that a corporation is going in, or that our legislators are going in. You can affect laws, you can demand that things change. So they really have lived out their mission.
oh, wow. So, what sort of issues does Food and Water Watch take on? And you could talk, mainly about here in Ventura County. Give us a couple of examples, and if you know of any issues that have been resolved locally here in Ventura County.
In general, the work that's done through Food and Water Watch is to protect people from corporations and other destructive economic interests that put profit ahead of everything else. Locally, there's been one really big win that we can credit Food and Water Watch with. So in 2019, after 3 years of work, a local grassroots group led by Food and Water Watch stopped the expansion of drilling 35 new oil wells in Oxnard. This initially was approved by the county, but then there are 30 days after an approval for new drilling where someone can appeal it. The organization I worked for appealed it. You have to pay $1,000, and then that put in motion a lot of other pieces. Took 3 years, got slowed down for a number of reasons. The permit was ultimately denied. And the reason that it was, the claim by the group fighting for this said that it really was placing additional burden on disadvantaged community members who already have the highest rates of pesticide pollution and air pollution.
So it was really a social justice issue.
It was. And it was the first time ever in the century that the county denied a new oil permit.
Oh my gosh. Well, we're going to get into that in a minute. In order to hold decision makers accountable, why is it so important to have, as you mentioned, grassroots support to really have an impact?
There's two types of power. Well, it's really about having community members understand their own sense of power, because often we have it, but we don't know it. And if you bring everyone together, then you collectively have more power. And it can be used in two ways. It can either be used on a specific electoral vote. So if it's for or against a candidate, like trying to recall a governor, that's electoral work. Or it could be just a larger campaign, like wanting to stop fracking in a county, where there's no specific timeline, but a group of citizens or residents just decides enough is enough. And when you get enough grassroots power, the folks that are in power start to worry that they might have their power taken away. So it's really a struggle between powerful, entities, the grassroots people and the people that are afraid of losing their power. And so if you can find their vulnerable spots, their weaknesses, you can exploit that, and then they'll compromise so that they can still stay in power. That's the short answer.
Right. I'm sure there's a much longer one. So you mentioned earlier, that we can pump oil and we still can save our water. Talk about that a little bit.
We are facing a time in our society and globally where we're needing to get off of oil and move to renewable, sustainable energy. Because of climate change, this is extremely critical. We all know it now. And so it's just a matter of how quickly can we move in that direction. For the time being, while we're in the midst of this transition, while we're putting up more wind turbines and solar panels, we will still be pumping oil out of the ground.
Right.
And as long as that's happening, we want to make sure we do it safely, because we have water aquifers underfoot, and that's where we draw our fresh water from. We need to make sure that we can get that water out and that it's not contaminated while it's still underground. So we need to be able to get oil and water out of the ground safely right now.
Right. So we really need to look at that. We're going to get into that in just a minute. But before we get to talking about measures A and B and getting that water out safely, a history of oil well drilling and permitting would set the scene for why permitting is now on the ballot. So would you give your listeners some background?
November 2020, the Board of Supervisors here in Ventura County voted to make a change to the permitting process for oil drilling for some of the oil drillers. This decision and vote didn't impact all oil drillers. And here's why. We had and we still have two sets of rules in place when it comes to oil drilling. There's a set of rules tied to permits that were handed out in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, 1930s, 40s,
Well,
and 50s.
a little long ago.
Yes, and these permits allowed any number of wells to be drilled, any method of drilling, required no environmental review, and the permits never expire. So, 80 years later, they're still being used. And they can be passed down because they don't expire. So decade after decade, if one oil company left a certain drilling spot, the next driller that came onto that spot, if they wanted to drill deeper or, 100 feet over, they got that same permit from the old holder.
Right.
And so it's kind of this Wild West permitting system. However, in 1966, there were some laws passed in California, and there were suddenly new regulations because we knew more, right? We knew more about how to protect our health and how to drill safely so that there were fewer spills. And any permit that was handed out after that time has tighter restrictions. So think of when you buy a house, and you have the ownership of that house and the title. It would be as if those who bought a house before 1966 could do anything they wanted, no questions asked, versus if you bought the house after 1966, you had to go file for permits if you wanted to add on a room or put a gazebo in your backyard.
Yeah, or think about earthquakes because a lot of old buildings now need to be retrofitted because they didn't have that in the code at the time. People did
Right.
whatever they wanted.
Right. And imagine if you sold your house with an old permit to the next person, and they also then got the latitude of your loose rules. So this is what's happening with oil drillers. And we just need to bring those rules that still operate into alignment with the newer permits.
Right. So it's not a matter of refusing to give permits. It's just permits that are all the same, the old ones and the new ones, and that involves environmental review. So do you know how many wells have been drilled over the last century in Ventura County?
Yes, there's really good documentation for oil drilling. There have been 8,000.
Oh my gosh.
A little over 8,000 wells drilled. And many of those are now abandoned, about half. And some were abandoned, 80 years ago. Some more recently in the last decade, in the last few years. So it spans the entire century. And then there are a little less than half of those 8,000 are still active or could be active. They might not be pumping today, but you could start up the motor tomorrow and start pumping again.
What happens to all the old pipes and the oil rig paraphernalia and this stuff in the ground over time?
Right. There's a variety of circumstances. In some cases, they were built with wood casings that went down and a wood casing around it. And that was a long time ago. I mean, by now they've collapsed. Dirt has filled up portions of it. You might not even see it from the surface.
Right.
Some wells were stuffed with, whatever they could find in the area. So they're not really sealed up in a way that's adequate, but it was the best they could do back in the old days.
Right. At a time when progress was everything, and and we thought that resources were limitless.
Right.
And we're going to have to leave that thought there for a minute while we do a station ID. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the women's room where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good. My guest today is Julie Henszey of Ventura County Save Agriculture and Fresh Water for Everybody, which advocates for protecting our food, water, and planet's health. Julie is affiliated with a grassroots group mounting an effort called Yes on Measures A and B, which will be on the ballot in June. Okay, and we're back, and we're just talking about environmental review, oil wells, and the fact that there used to be no environmental review, and that's what's in contention right now and will be on the ballot. So the major problem, and I think you touched on this, but it bears repeating, with the permitting of drilling new wells or changing existing wells in some way, is what? What about the permitting is so bad?
The current system, to recap, the current system allows some wells to be drilled without environmental review. Some parcels of land have permits where there is no environmental review. And this is bad because if we don't survey the area, if we don't look at the stability of the land, at the wildlife and habitation around it, at the communities that might live in the area, then we cannot take into account the potential damage and consequences of drilling in that spot.
Right, and that's part of an environmental review, looking at what's all around, getting the whole picture.
Right.
So the oil drilling companies want to keep the old way of issuing permits, in other words, drilling without environmental review, which would, of course, be cheaper and more convenient for their business. This, as you said, was actually passed by the Ventura County Board of Supervisors, but now it's on the ballot again, because what we want is to have consistent rules, and what we have right now is two sets of rules. Could you explain to your listener what you mean by two sets of rules?
Right. We currently have permits that allow drillers complete discretion, and a set of rules that have stricter regulations. And these we interchangeably call them permits or rules. What we want to do is just have the older rules fade away or be replaced with the more strict current environmental regulations that apply to the newer permits. And the oil industry will state that their industry is highly regulated. And for newer permits, it is. But what they don't tell people is that there are these old permits out there with very few regulations.
Right, and it bears repeating also that these old permits never expire. So let's get into what geologic feature makes this inconsistent permitting laws for drilling a new well, or expanding or changing or even abandoning a well even higher stakes. What is under them?
Yes, we have aquifers underground, and these are natural stores of water where water collects over time. It ultimately comes from the sky, right? As rainwater, can collect as snow in the mountains, can run down our hillsides and into a stream, and a portion of that soaks into the ground, makes its way down to the aquifers. I never knew this, but aquifers can be stacked on top of each other.
Oh.
But just as you can see different layers of rock when you see a cutaway maybe where a road has been built and they've had to blast out the side of a hill. There are layers of aquifers. They're much deeper, much thicker, but they can be stacked on top of each other. We don't have a lot of choices in how we get our water, here in California. The only local supply would be the underground aquifers and anything we can pull out of a lake or a reservoir or a river.
Right. And these aquifers are millions of years old. They've been forming. And, am I correct in thinking that these are layers of sediment that is hardened and the water permeates into those layers of sediment and is stored there?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
It's not so much an underground lake, which is what's commonly believed. It's more like a sponge that has absorbed a lot of water.
That's a good image. The wells are drilled right over these aquifers and our only source of local safe water. It may, seem obvious, but talk about why the aquifer is even more important now that we're in this mega drought.
Right. The aquifers, for example, the aquifers on the Oxnard Plain, just east of or all around Oxnard, they provide drinking water for 400,000 people. And throughout the county, 85% of our agricultural water that's used to grow the crops that we have, 85% of that water comes from our underground aquifers. And it supports a $2 billion agricultural industry. So we can't afford to lose what little water we have in these aquifers.
And these mega droughts, we're in one that would happen like every 1,200 years.
Right. And we have, just like in the Central Valley, we've depleted our aquifers because we're overusing them. Well, they're becoming more depleted than they should be. So yeah, a mega drought just makes it harder. And if we lose the aquifer, if we contaminate our water in these aquifers from oil wells that have been unregulated, then we're in big trouble.
Yeah, those stakes are pretty high. So the oil deposits are actually between the layers of sediment holding water in the aquifer. So what are some risks for accidents that could potentially happen to the aquifer and to our water if there are missteps in drilling or changing the wells because they're either near or they're drilling directly over the aquifer?
Right. And they not only drill over, sometimes they drill through. There are actually 1,500 oil and gas wells either drilled on top or through our aquifers. We know that there are natural pathways that go from one layer to another. There are gases and fluids that will travel in these natural pathways. If you have a crack in the layer or sediment, that's a natural gap where liquid or gas could travel. And so if you have a busted oil pipe or gas pipe, then it will find a natural pathway to a different point in the layers.
Oh,
so if that natural pathway led to the aquifer, then we're in trouble.
wow. So how many wells could potentially be drilled using these same antiquated permits? Do you have a number on that?
Well, if we're looking at the future, if we've drilled 8,000 already, there's no limit to the number that could be drilled in the future.
Wow, yeah.
Just a matter of where the gas is, where the oil and gas is.
Right. So are some oil companies responsible and follow safety regulations? Of course, if they have a later permit, then they have to, correct?
Correct. And if we can get the old permits, their conditions in alignment with the new permits, it won't be retroactive. It won't affect any current drilling or operation. It will only affect the possible approval of something new in the future.
Right. So we can still drill oil and save our water, as you mentioned before. Like so many referendum measures, A and B have legal language that I find when I'm reading these, I really need to go to an expert because they're difficult to understand. So could you explain just briefly and clearly why are these measures on the ballot in June?
Right. It does look like gobbledygook. There's there's no really making sense of what the referendum language says. It's just, maybe 40 words, but it's very confusing. The reason voters are deciding this issue is that the Board of Supervisors did vote to have one consistent permitting process and bring the old rules in alignment with the new. But the oil industry gathered enough signatures to pause the enactment of the ordinance and put it on the ballot instead.
Right. So what would a yes vote mean? We're running out of time here, so we need to clarify that.
A yes vote would mean that the old permits become consistent with the new permits.
And a no vote would mean?
That things continue the way they are. Yep.
Okay, so when is the primary election in California?
June 7.
That's June 7, 2022. And where can listeners contact you or get more information?
To learn more about this issue and get in touch with us is to go to the website where we are addressing this issue, which is vcsafe.org.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, Julie Henszey of Save Agriculture and Fresh Water for Everyone, for educating our listeners about Food and Water Watch, and also for explaining what is meant by measures A and B that will be on the ballot June 7th. This is KPPQ LP Ventura, 104.1 FM, and we're in the Women's Room, where we appreciate and support each other. I'm your host, Kathleen Good.